Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So here, as you can see, I'm Victor Ferro, and I'm be hosting and moderating today's session. So it's a pleasure to have you all here to join us for a new EULAS webinar. So welcome, and don't forget to please subscribe and like and follow us on all our social media accounts, so Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Now, let's dive into today's topic. During the heyday of globalization, regionalism flourished. Commercial and financial liberalization provided a fertile ground for regional initiatives, which continued to proliferate throughout the 2000s, even as some regions, notably Latin America, pursued more politically and socially oriented models of integration. Today, regional organizations and initiatives persist against a markedly more hostile backdrop of geopolitical tensions, rising protectionism, multilateral crisis, and the erosion of the international liberal order. Why do they endure and how? These are central questions animating the two volumes of essays of global regionalism. To discuss the book's contributions to EULAC regionalism and interregionalism, we are pleased to welcome the following speakers. So we have two of the five book editors, Juliana Peixoto, first of all, researcher at FLACSO Argentina and CONICET, specializing in multilateral trading system, regional integration, and international cooperation. And we also have the pleasure of Philippe de Lombaerde from United Nations University, director of the United Nations University Institute on Comparative and Regional Integration Studies, and specialist in international economics and comparative regionalism. And we also have the pleasure of receiving two of the authors of the book. So the two researchers wrote a chapter in the first volume. So first we have Frank Mattheis from the United Nations University, a research fellow at the United Nations University, specializing in comparative regionalism and interregionalism with a focus on Africa, Europe, and Latin America. And finally, we also have the pleasure of welcoming María Victoria Álvarez from Universidad Nacional de Rosario, professor and researcher at the Faculty of Political Science and International Relations of Universidad Nacional de Rosario, and director of the study group on the European Union at the UNR. So without further ado, I think that I can already give the floor to the editors of the book to present a little bit, to have a brief but broad overview of their work. So Philippe and Juliana, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I will start and then Juliana will complement. First of all, thank you very much to the Jean Monnet Network and the Book Club for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to present this publication. Our essays on global regionalism, here you can see them. No, you cannot. Maybe. I tried, but it's not working. Well, anyway. The essays on global regionalism were published some time ago, beginning of this year. Open access, were published open access, so I would like to underline this. So don't hesitate to have a look at it. It's the result of an ambitious project, I should say, a collection of 100 essays altogether, gathering around 140 authors. So I think it's a very ambitious project that was launched on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of UNU-CRIS, our institute. For those who do not know us, we are one of the institutes of United Nations University, specializing on research and capacity building related to regional governance. So 25th anniversary, we thought, was a good occasion to launch a project like this to reflect on, let's say, the past, the future, and we did that basically at two levels. And so it is a reflection on our, let's say, object of study. We study regions, we study regionalisms in the world. So it is a reflection on the phenomenon and the importance of that phenomenon today and in the future. But there is also another level of analysis, if you wish. It is also a reflection on how we have been studying regions in the past and how we could study regions in the future. And so these two levels are basically also then visualized into these two volumes. The object of study, the regions, the future of regions is basically volume 2. And then the reflection on the how are we studying these regions today, in the past, and in the future is basically the content of volume 1, even if, of course, in many of the essays, there is a connection between these two levels. So what you will find in this rich collection of essays, and I underline these are essays and not full classical papers, but rather essays, shorter pieces, different styles, some more personal, some more academic. What you will see in this rich collection of essays is this evolution of the object, but also the evolution of thinking about regions. So in some of the essays, we go back 100 years ago, 200 years ago to see, okay, what were these ideas that emerged related to regions, the first forms of theorizing, if you wish, conceptualizing regions in different parts of the world. We look at the 19th century, more structured thinking about regions. We look at then the contributions within a more modern social science context after the Second World War, regional integration studies, new regionalism, comparative regionalism. And we are moving, and that is also then the title of our book, moving towards what we call global regionalism. Now, this concept of global regionalism obviously reflects a discussion that is going on and in global IR, for example, for those of you who are working in the area of international relations. And that in turn is part of a broader reflection, a broader discussion nowadays on the social sciences, also a self-reflection on how we are doing social sciences in the world of today, which is a more horizontal world, and also the academic world, which is or becoming less dependent on certain centers of activity, of power within that system. So it's to be framed within that context of global IR and a rethinking of the social sciences more in general. In order to structure our ideas, but also to structure the book, we have basically focused on 4 guiding questions. The first question was, what are the global origins of regionalism thinking? The idea was to have a sort of broad view on where have ideas emerged, a broad view on this variety of ideas that have emerged in different places, in different contexts, in different historical times, and so on. Second question, how relevant is mainstream theorizing still? If you think of how global regionalism should look like in the future, you should also, of course, have an idea, okay, what is the status of what we have done so far? How useful is that still? How can it be transformed and so on? Or is that something that we should get rid of and so on? Third question, how could or should global regionalism look like if we want to do a better job than the job that we did in the past? What does that exactly mean in terms of the research questions that we should be asking, in terms of the empirical translation of our work, the methods that we are using, the data that we are using, the perspectives, and so on. And then the fourth question, which we framed a bit in a provocative way, was, will regions save the world? Which is then a question about, again, the object of study. We are studying regions. Are they still relevant? Will they be relevant? And so on in the future from an empirical perspective, but also from a more normative perspective. What should regions do, or what could regional organizations do? Where are the gaps that they can fill, the governance gaps in a number of policy areas that these regional organizations could fill or should fill? And so these were the four guiding questions. The first three questions are the ones about the how to study regions. They are part of volume one. The last question, will regions save the world? So the reflection on the object of study per se is then part of volume two. Within volume two, we then look at more, let's say we have more region-specific contributions. Other contributions are more global. And we also touch upon, and this is relevant also in this context of this network, we also look at the future of interregionalism, how regions speak to each other, for example, Europe, Latin America, which is of interest in this case. What you will not find in these volumes, of course, is a consensus view and a short answer to all these questions. Obviously, you will find a diversity of opinions. I think that's the richness of the book. This diversity reflects the diversity in the authorship, geographically, in terms of ages, disciplines, but obviously, on top of that, diversity in terms of what these people think, and so on. So you will find a diversity of opinions, but I think what connects all these people is an openness to think, to think, let's say, creatively about the future of our area of study, to present a fresh look at regions and a willingness to engage also with the other authors of the other pieces. And of course, there are different views, and it's also good that there are these different views which do not always coincide. There are remaining questions, open questions there, starting from the ontology. Are we talking about the same things when we talk about regions? Do we understand each other? There are questions, open questions about theory. What do we mean by a theory in this context? What do we mean by theorizing? Are general theories possible? Is our aim to come up with more general theories? Is that possible at all? How do we balance this with taking into account specific contexts, historical context, geographical, cultural context, and so on? How to balance this? There are questions about the sociology of the regionalism scholarship. How are we organized? Who are we? Where do we come from? And how does that have an impact on what we do, and so on? So I can only invite you to have a look at this collection of essays. Explore. There is a very rich collection out there. So this is basically an invitation to have a look at it. I will now hand over to Juliana, who is a co-editor, as already mentioned, co-editor of these two volumes, and who will say a few words about the Latin American dimension of all this. And obviously, Latin America is an important region for two reasons. One is that you have this rich experience with regionalism within the broader Latin American region, and you have, of course, a very active scholarly community studying regions in Latin America, and María Victoria and Juliana are a demonstration of this. So over to you, Juliana.
Thank you, Philippe. Well, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar and the EULAS Network as well for creating this opportunity to discuss the book. And my special thanks to Victor Ferro for his excellent coordination and for bringing us together in this conversation. So as Philippe said, I focus on the contribution of Latin America to the project, trying to highlight how the the intellectual traditions and experiences of the regionalism in Latin America connect with the agenda of global regionalism developed in this two-volume book. Well, one of the central arguments of the book is that regionalism has always been a global phenomenon, even if the study of regionalism has often been shaped by the European experiences and theoretical frameworks. So from this perspective, Latin America has a long tradition of regional thinking that many times predates many of the regional projects that later become central to the literature. Ideas such as Pan-Americanism, the Patria Grande, which is a sort of Latin American great homeland, and different projects of political, economic, and legal cooperation emerged during the 19th century as part of the broader struggles for independence and international recognition. Regionalism in Latin America was also closely linked to questions of sovereignty, development, identity, and international order beyond economic integration. So this historical path makes Latin America particularly relevant for the agenda of global regionalism. The region has consistently generated alternative understandings of regional cooperation that do not necessarily fit the assumptions of classical European integration theories. Latin American regionalism has often been driven by concerns about autonomy, development, social inclusion, and the management of asymmetries as well. And it has also produced a rich diversity of institutional experiences, ranging from the OAS in all the Inter-American system to Mercosur, to Andean Community, UNASUR, CELAC, and many others. At the same time, Latin America has been one of the regions where debates associated with what is now called global IR have found particularly fertile ground. Scholars from Latin America have long questioned the universal applicability of theories developed in the global north and have highlighted the importance of incorporating diverse historical experiences, local knowledge, and alternative perspectives into the study of the discipline of IR. In many ways, the intellectual motivations behind global IR resonate with Latin American debates on dependency, autonomy, development, regionalism, and South-South cooperation. And this is reflected in the composition of the two-volume book. The book includes a significant number of the contributions from Latin America and addresses themes that have been central to the intellectual and political experience of the region. So the Latin America contribution is especially appreciated in this book because it shows that regionalism can take multiple forms, pursue different objectives, and rather than measuring regional projects against a single model, Latin American experiences encourage us to think about regionalism as a sort of multi-layered phenomenon, a plural phenomenon, shaped by distinct historical trajectories, political priorities, and, of course, economic and social realities. So we invite you to read the contribution from Latin America and from all the regions of the world included in these two great volumes. I think I can stop here. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Philippe and Juliana. And now I'd like to give the floor for the first speaker, one of the first authors that is going to present her paper here that is included in one of the volumes. So, Vicky, if you want to start with your presentation, so the floor is again yours. Please.
Yes, good morning or good evening. Thank you to the organizers of this webinar, especially, of course, Victor, but also Emilia and the whole EULAS team thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here sharing this panel with two of the distinguished editors of the book, Juliana and Philippe, and also with Frank, a fellow contributor and colleague. Just let me say first that the short essay I wrote looks at the relevance of theories of European integration for understanding regional dynamics in Latin America. Of course, this has been extensively addressed, but I focus on disintegration because, a few years ago, we all were talking about disintegration and try to explore whether and how some theoretical approaches developed to explain European experience can also help us make sense of what happened in Latin America. Of course, in line with what Philippe was saying, I should emphasize that this was intended to be a short essay, a very exploratory piece, rather than offering definitive answers. My goal was to start a conversation and to reflect on both the potential but also the limits of applying European theories to regional experiences in Latin America. So I see it just as a first step toward a broader and deeper discussion. Okay, so first of all, why study disintegration? This was, as I said, an issue, a concern for many scholars. Recent crises in the European Union, but also in Latin America, were unlike early ones, Brexit, the Euro crisis, or the collapse of UNASUR, for example, all forced us scholars to look at a process running in reverse. Yes, yet most theories were built to explain how regions come together, how they progress, and not how they fall apart. But in the case of Latin America, there were some questions. For instance, how can we study the dismantling of integration processes in regions that have yet to achieve a certain level of integration? How can something that is not yet fully integrated disintegrate? Are these questions even relevant, or are we approaching this from a Eurocentric perspective? Another question was, is it feasible to study the disintegration of regional schemes when in some cases there are no formal organizations present? And what are we comparing? What is disintegrated? Organizations, governance structures, or something else entirely? Of course, I don't have to go through this. We all know that Europe and Latin America are two very singular cases. There are some common reasons to compare, but also particular reasons to be very careful in this comparison. I'm not going to go through in detail, but differences are huge in terms of institutional commitments, the actors that really have dominance, have a role in these processes are different. Okay, and I try to address three challenges of comparative regionalism that are interconnected. First of all, as we know, diversity, the infamous problem of n equals 1. Can we even compare these regions? Another big challenge was polysemy, as we know, regionness, regionalism, etc., is a big obstacle, a big problem for comparative regionalism. And of course, from the Latin American perspective, the Eurocentrism problem is another issue, another challenge to bear in mind. So what I just did was to think about some of the European theoretical perspectives as a toolbox, not as a template. And to share I share the view of some other colleagues that argue that the more abstract a concept, the further it travels. So the challenge is mainly to avoid an uncritical, decontextualized application and to give European theories or some of their concepts, of their tools, their proper dimension. What I did was bring together a very limited sample of some approaches from EU studies, international relations, political science, and then conduct a very preliminary assessment of whether and how well they could travel to and help explain the Latin American experience, especially the crisis of regionalism. My approach was simply to map out different theoretical perspectives, some focus on governance, others on integration, and other ones on institutions. So I think that maybe neo-functionalism revisited was one possible perspective approach that could be useful, especially some of its concepts like spill around, spill back, encapsulate. Okay. What about liberal intergovernmentalism? Okay. Here there were some scholars who tried to use it. I must warn that some of the premises of liberal intergovernmentalism has to be taken very careful, because in the Latin American context, executive powers and especially presidents have a decisive role. So here we have to be very, very careful. I also took another two different frameworks, the Walter Matthei's eclectic framework of demand and supply. This could be helpful to explain some developments, and also the literature on politicization. It has been already applied to the Latin American context. If we focus on institutions, maybe rational choice institutionalism or historical institutionalism could be worth trying to use them. Also, a much modern or contemporary approach, counter-institutionalization, even if conceived in Europe with a vision of the global setting, might has its own merits to analyze some cases in the Latin American context. But okay, so as a conclusion, this short essay could not address every potential way in which European theories could be relevant to other regions. Of course, no single theory can effectively explain the diverse trajectories of regionalism forward or backward. So I consider that I think that understanding integration and even a stagnation, reversal and disintegration requires a plural theoretical toolbox. And I think that European theories retain some analytical relevance beyond Europe, but yet their explanatory power in Latin America lies not in direct transplantation, but in their adaptation to regional realities. Thank you.
Perfect. So thanks, Vicky, for the presentation. And now I'd like to give the floor to Frank Mattheis, who is also going to present his contribution to one of the volumes. So please, Frank, feel free, and the moment is yours.
Thank you very much, Victor, also for bringing us together, and thanks to the EULAS network for having this idea. So it's a great pleasure for me as well to be among three esteemed colleagues that have all contributed to these double-volumed essays. So we've been tasked to look at global regionalism, the overall topic of the two volumes, but link it a bit with the interest of the EULAS network, so EU-Latin America relations specifically. And I'll do it through the chapter that I contributed to the volume, which deals specifically with a link between global regionalism and interregionalism. So unlike Vicky, I don't have slides, so you'll just have to look at me. But as Philippe says, the essays are available open access, so you can go online, and I think the links have been circulated already. So when talking about interregionalism, the first thing we do have to take a step back first and to look at, well, how do we understand regionalism? And the previous presentation, especially by Vicky, has really shown that, well, there's different notions and we don't necessarily always talk about the same thing, but as a very basic definition, I work with regionalism as being the deliberate attempt, a social and political project to create a region. So it's not necessarily something that exists yet or is fully institutionalized, but there is the will and a decision that creating a region beyond national state borders is a good thing. And these type of regionalisms, you have them in one form or another, whether in Latin America or in Europe, since nation states were created. So it's something. As soon as nation states were created, you already have projects or at least consideration of how to overcome the borders that have just been established. However, most of the theorizing, and Vicky showed it quite well, came then after the Second World War, so mainly driven from looking at the European experience of integration, but then also contributions from other parts of the world, especially in Latin America with Sepal and other sources of knowledge, but also in Africa and Asia, where we see decolonization happening in tandem with attempts to create regions that overcome divisions that were inherited from imperial and colonial constellations. What we see in the very beginning of theories and concepts of regionalism is that the external dimension, so in particular interregionalism, so which would be the relationship between one regional project with another, whether it's a completely external one or one that partly overlaps or is even nested. So looking at interregionalism was something really considered very secondary. So there's most of the theoretical effort was on, well, why do countries cooperate together even though they're supposed to be competitors? How do they deal with national sovereignty? What about the political elites that are being created, the epistemic communities that are created on a regional level, or much more technical and functional questions of economic cooperation and other cross-border flows. But the external dimension initially has been sort of seen as secondary, so regional integration is something that happened internally. This has overlooked the fact that many regional organizations have, from the start already, a vision about the world, about something that goes more really beyond their own regional borders. It is often driven by certain values or certain ideology, so about the place that they see for the region in the world, and this is fundamental in many regional integration projects, that they're not just an internal tool, but really they have also, they encapsulate, they represent about, well, which place in the world do we have as a region, and how do we want to influence also the rest of the world and bring regional values, regional ways of thinking, regional considerations to other parts of the world. So this has conceptualizing this has come much later. Like the proper work on interregionalism theories is maybe 20-25 years old. If we speak of trying to find categories that encapsulate the different ways of how regions engage. So initially it was a more one could say more technical approach to trying to categorize, well, what kind of different interregionalisms do we have? What kind of actors engage? Is it regional organizations? Is it regional hegemons? Is it subgroups of loose countries that act together, non-state actors, etc.? So firstly, it was really to distinguish, well, what kind of process are we dealing with? Because of the dominance that internal regional integration had in the theorizing of regionalism, initially we had this as a one-way street. So the idea was, well, first you need regional integration to happen. You need a certain institutional capacity. You need to have a certain consensus among the region about what you want to do. And then, as a second step, only would you have interregionalism happening. So once you, just very practically speaking, once you have the capacity to formally conduct foreign relations, once you have a mandate, once you can establish some sort of embassies or permanent representations abroad, then you are able to actually conduct something. Or once you have a mandate, say, to conduct a free trade agreement with another region. So these would be all outcomes of a regional integration process that would have to happen first. This, in a way, has been a very EU-centered view of conceptualizing interregionalism. So the idea is that, well, first you have some sort of deep integration happening, a strong institutional building, a whole foreign service that has been created, and then eventually then you interact with the rest of the world. If we take a step back from that more Eurocentric approach and look also how we can make the concept of interregionalism relevant for Latin America and Latin America related issues, we have to look the other way around. And the European integration approaches are not so helpful here, also because there's this very bias of considering that, well, the EU is the most advanced and developed. So in a way, it always comes first. So it's very difficult to instill the notion that, well, actually, it might have been shaped by interregional relations as well. So to give one concrete example, in the African Union had developed relatively early things such as having a permanent representation at the United Nations already back in the 70s, or it already had a very strong mandate on peace and security issues. So way before the EU actually had a mission in New York, or way before the EU had its common security and defense policy. And the interaction that the EU had with the African Union also brought in a way knowledge and the aspiration to develop similar tools to it. But this part of the story is often eclipsed because there is this unidirectional approach. So for Latin America, it does matter to consider the other way around. So not only asking, well, how does regionalism create or shape interregional relations, but the other way around. So how does interregional relations that exist, how do they impact on regionalism, and specifically on regionalism in Latin America, whether it's intended or unintended? So there have been some, particularly from the EU, there have been very intended ways of interacting with Latin America, directly supporting, say, Mercosur and the institutionalization of its parliament, for instance, or where you have really direct support, but then in many other instances, it's very unintended. It's not that you have another region that is trying to reshape Latin American regionalism, but it's something that happens as a secondary effect. So we can have effects on strengthening certain actors, undermining other regional actors, circumventing regional organizations, prioritizing some, enhancing the capacity, enhancing the visibility. So this has really been something that is important to acknowledge, and it is important also to acknowledge the trends that we have over the last 10, 15 years in EU Latin America relations, which is namely a shift from the high political level of interregionalism, so where the main center of attention, both empirically but also conceptually, was on the big summits of presidents and foreign ministers, on the big negotiations, the treaties, free trade agreements between subregions of Latin America with the EU. So a lot of attention was on this. And also from a very positivistic way of thinking. So assuming that, well, this interregionalism will necessarily have a positive effect on Latin American regionalism. As it turned out, many of these expectations were at least misleading, because what we do see is that there is a lower level of interregionalism that seems to be reshaping regionalism in a much more profound way, but less visible. So it's not the big summits, but we have proper cooperation. We still have dozens of projects that the EU is conducting with Latin America or in Latin America that are very much issue specific. So where you will have an interregional project that is focusing on a particular element of security, say on cybersecurity, or it will look at developing particular regional health structures or cooperation between research agencies from different countries. So these are projects which are in a way much smaller, much more targeted on specific policy issues. But they also reshape regionalism because they do not go through a regional organization. So they are not, in the beginning, they partly still were, but there's not one Latin American actor that is engaging with these and receiving these and distributing, trying to bring together all Latin American countries, but it's much more pick and choose. It is based on political will. So you have opt-in, opt-out possibilities. So if one Latin American country wants to join a particular project on, say, cybersecurity, it's open to do so, but that doesn't mean it will necessarily also join the regional research cooperation. So you have, instead of having one grand project of regional integration or one organization through which this is going, you have several layers of issue-specific integration, and which is not necessarily coherent in terms of geography. It's not necessarily the same countries. It's not necessarily the same type of institution buildings that is done. Some are more supranational, some are more really voluntarily. But what we see is much more fragmentation and a pluralistic view of how regionalism is done in Latin America. So with this, I'll conclude. For me, this is really the main trend that we see both theoretically but also empirically. We could talk, of course, also about that there's a whole new interregionalism wave that is coming, that is happening outside of the EU, so with Africa, but also with Asia, with Russian regionalisms that get involved in Latin America as well. So there's also a pluralism here, that it's not only a monopoly of the EU to be an interregional actor in Latin America, but really what I want to stress here is to think about it globally means to reverse the directionality, that it's not just regionalism that produce interregionalism, but also the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank, for the presentation. So I have already written here on the chat, but just for you to know that we have the Q&A box here right now. So that's how we're going to proceed to the Q&A part of the session. So feel free to ask any questions that you wish to all the speakers here, to the editors, to the authors of the book. And actually, we already have one question that I think is directed at the editors of the book. So it is listed here as an anonymous attendee. So thanks for the presentation, and a question for the panel. So how is the concept of global regionalism useful to understand the diverse regional integration attempts? And I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator as well to ask a question to Vicky, to María Victoria, and to Frank about their chapters. So to Vicky, my question is, your chapter argues that the EU-centered theories such as functionalism and liberal intergovernmentalism can be readapted to Latin American integration and in this integration context. Do you think that they could also be reappropriated by Latin American theorists as the basis for a genuinely Latin American theory of integration and disintegration, and even a theory that could be capable of traveling back and illuminating regional dynamics beyond Latin America itself? And to Frank, my question is, how can the global regionalism approach, whose core premise is to avoid EU-centrism, be applied to interregionalism when the phenomenon of interregionalism itself remains heavily shaped by EU external policy towards other regional groupings? And for all the attendees, remember, you can still keep asking here through the Q&A box. So let's start with the answers, and then probably we are going, let's see if we have still time to another Q&A round. Thank you for the presentation. So maybe the editors first. So Philippe and Juliana.
Well, let me maybe just say or respond to the first question. How does global regionalism help in understanding the diverse forms of regional integration? I would like to say two things about this. I think what the message is of what we call global regionalism as a perspective or a method, if you wish, is that in order to understand this diversity and in order to understand how these different cases of regionalism develop, that you have to take into account probably a specific set of variables, to use that word, in each case, and then to understand that the drivers, the effects, but also the manifestations, the forms of regionalisms in different places are different. The drivers can be different, the aims can be different, the forms can be different, and that is something that we should understand. So the set of variables that will explain to the extent that they can explain how things go, will be different. So you need different sets. But at the same time, I think all these variables, explanations can be part of one toolbox. And so, which is then used in different ways in different places. At the same time, when we say global regionalism, and I think we are still convinced that it is possible also to talk in more general terms about regionalism. It's not that things are uncomparable or are comparable. I think there are things that are comparable and there are things that are less comparable. So I think it still makes sense to talk to each other and to talk regionalism more in general. Now, in the formulation of your question, you already also point to another thing, which is the use of concepts. So you use the concept of regional integration in a general way, and you talk about diverse forms of regional integration. It is also, or it might be useful also to think about indeed the definition of the concepts that we are using, and we are not always using these things in the same way. We should be conscious about this, and that is also, I think, part of the messages that we are sending. We should be conscious of this, and then regional integration can also be reserved, for example, as a term which is specifically used for specific forms of regionalism, which imply, for example, supranationality or the creation of supranational institutions, giving up or pooling sovereignty and so on. So this is something we should be aware of, that the terms we are using and always in the same way, and so it's important to clarify this. Okay, I think I will stop here. I don't know, Juliana, if you want to add something.
Yes, just a little point on I think that the advantage or the of global regionalism is to take advantage of all the discussion on global IR and to overcome this idea that regional integration history is in some how the history of European Union or the theories are shaped by this model. So I think it's more about open opportunities to think more broadly and to overcome this debate, and to more than try to compare, but in the path trying to compare, trying to build this toolbox. It's more about open the debate to the different regions and different process of regional integration and regionalism thinking around the world.
Okay, so just before Vicky and Frank, one more question we have here from the audience. So brief question. So thanks for the presentation. How do you see the current context of multiple crises or polycrisis affecting regionalist and interregionalist projects around the world, and particularly in Latin America and Europe? I didn't want to interrupt you. It was just because that I felt that this question was broad and it was going to be really nice to put this question to everybody, because I think this is going to be a good discussion. So who wants to start? Or if Vicky and Frank want to address the questions I asked you first, then we can go to this broader question later, because I think this is going to be a question for all of you four, honestly.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Victor, for your very interesting question. You got me to think about this, and this is very, very interesting, because what you are asking is if we can see this dialogue in reverse, like we can show, we can teach something to our fellow European scholars, and I think that yes, I think that the answer is affirmative. I think that especially concerning crisis and resilience, I think we can show that Latin America can be Latin American regionalism can endure without supranational institutions. That institutional weakness, does not necessarily imply failure. That there are some institutional arrangements, even interpresidential arrangements that can work, and also a very important message is that regionalism is not always linear or always progressive. We can find cycles, right? Cycles of crisis, and then another type of arrangement, or to keep moving. So yeah, I would love to to see if we from Latin America can show something, can I don't know, teach is a very strong word, but you know what I mean. It's like if we can really develop some theoretical perspectives, even as a toolbox, to help to enlighten our European scholars, that would be awesome. I think that the dialogue, even whichever is the direction, the dialogue is always enriching. And so, yeah, thank you, Victor, for your question.
I'll follow up from that, and thank you, Victor, for the question. And no, I completely agree with Vicky that there's really value in having this as a dialogue in both senses. So to your question about, well, we want to overcome EU-centrism, but we still have the empirical challenge of having the EU as a major case, whether it's for regionalism itself, but also for interregionalism across the world as well. There are different ways to approach this. So you do have the empirical approach. So in terms of case selection, so from a more radical point of view of saying, well, we're going to, in the first step, exclude the EU from conceptualization, and then once we have defined and refined concepts that are inductively coming from other world regions, then we can see to what degree they are also applicable to the EU or not. It's one way to conceptualize. It sometimes can feel a bit artificial. So what often is easier to do is to still include the EU, but to try to avoid considering this as the ideal type, as sort of the golden standard, which then means that all other regional projects across the world are sort of seen as deviations, and sort of the closer, the more they resemble the EU, the more they're considered as proper or like successful regionalism. So to overcome this, to not think of it as a dichotomy that you have all the EU on one side and then the rest of the world, but really looking for what are certain mechanisms that are not unique to any particular region. How they unfold empirically might be very different and is very much contextualized in every region, but that we do have certain mechanisms, that certain questions about how what's the relationship between regional integration and national sovereignty is something that will be answered differently in different world regions, but it's a question that makes sense in all of them. Also, looking not only at things that might look similar on the surface. So we do have, for instance, say other regional organizations also have permanent representation, like the EU has. The EU, of course, has them in almost every country in the world, but we have, say, the African Union has about 10 external representations, and other regional organizations as well. So it's to consider, well, the external representation of a regional organization is not per se a European phenomena, but it's really a diplomatic phenomena that can be studied from different cases. Thank you.
So thanks a lot for the answers. Thanks a lot for the presentation. We already achieved the mark of 1 hour of the webinar, but since we have 2 more questions, I'm going to pick one last one just to finish this, and then I can think that we can have at least 3 to 5 more minutes at least to address this question that comes from Martin Castro that says, how do you see the difficulties to achieve coherence between national and government interests with regional compromises? A very broad question, so I'm going to leave this one for you four. Who wants to start with this, maybe? Very briefly. And the other question that we had from an anonymous attendee as well, the person says, thank you very much for the generous and insightful presentations. If regionalism is often narrated today through crisis, what cases of conceptual interventions discussed in the book help us imagine regionalism otherwise, not simply as institutional integration, but as a site for generating new forms of political negotiation, representation, and collective futures? This is also related to the previous anonymous question that we had. So again, I'm going to leave the space for the speakers. Philippe, please.
Maybe just a few words on the previous question and then the question before that on crisis, also because they're all related, of course, in order to make progress, to use that word in terms of the regional project and the regional arrangements. Obviously, you need some kind of way to align, of course, the participants in that project. In the case of institutionalized forms of regional, so the member states, and that is then related to the question about crisis, and I would simply like to echo what María Victoria was about the dynamics of these processes, which are non-linear, which go through cycles, and what we have seen, of course, in the past is that crises are not simply things that are then reflected in crisis and regional crisis, but crises are also catalysts sometimes for progress, for new initiatives, and you can see this very well in the history, not only of the European case, but also in other cases, that crises are moments also then when interests and positions are realigned. And then I'm thinking of political actors who have to take the leadership, but then also the citizens and then how they look at the regions and what they expect from regions. And in the current context of polycrisis, and for instance, if you look at Europe, including obviously Ukraine, and you can feel and you can see that the perspective on Europe has changed, and what people expect from the region has changed. They are, as far as I can see, expecting more from the region in terms of security, for example, than 20 years ago. So this crisis moments are related to shifts in perspective, positioning, and so on, and can lead to indeed political leadership taking the lead in a certain direction. So that is one. The other thing is what we are reminded of when in this moment of polycrisis is the importance also of external factors in explaining how regionalism is manifesting itself or making progress. We are very often focusing on the internal factors. What are these member states doing together and why are they doing this? And producing regimes, producing regional public goods, producing stability in the region and so on. But there are these external factors which are sometimes more or less important. But what we're seeing now indeed is that these geopolitical changes in the world are determining certain dynamics, and that has to be looked at more closely. What the effect will be, the final effect will be on certain regional arrangements, and that brings us then to obviously then the question: and to what extent can regions be a complement or a substitute of what is missing globally in terms of global governance, and how can regions fill the gaps? I think this is also something that is on the agenda of policymakers in the coming years. And yeah, I think I will stop here.
Do anyone else want to add anything, Juliana?
Yes, a short point on the question on coherence between national and regional interests. I think that every process has its own birthmark. As for instance, I don't know, Mercosur is the core and strategic relationship between Argentina and Brazil. But and this is very important. But the process must build common objectives along the way. So it's important to build different and aggregated objectives beyond this birthmark. Otherwise, we are prisoners of this initial birthmark. And for instance, in Mercosur again, we are in one of the most complex moments in the relationship between Brazil and Argentina, and we have all this gap in the regional objectives because of this birthmark prison that we have go beyond these initial objectives and build regional objectives in the way of the resilience construction.
Perfect. Thanks, Juliana. Frank?
Yes, just briefly, I want to pick on the last question that was posed that I found particularly inspiring. So in terms of cases that can help us imagine regionalism beyond institutional integration, I'm thinking about non-state actors that work across borders and that respond to a certain regional identity. So whether it's city administrations, but can be also trade unions, where there is a network building and an alliance building as a counterweight to this politically executive-driven integration. So I think that there's where we see interesting new ways of imagining and renegotiating what the region should stand for, also ideologically. And conceptually speaking, I find in the book some elements about looking beyond the institution by looking more at the identity, at the imagination. Where does imagination come from in grasping what a region is? So what kind of symbols are being activated? What kind of images? But also in terms of, well, how do you draw the line between inside and outside, between inclusion and inclusion? What is part of the region and what is not? And so to look rather at this process which is not just purely institutional, but it's really about specific ideas and imagination. I think this might be quite helpful.
Perfect. So I think that we're done, especially because it was really good that you could have addressed all the questions that we had here from the audience. So I'd like to thank you very much to all the speakers that were here. So it was a pleasure that you could contribute to the EULAS network. And for all the other attendees that are here, I'd just like to remind you that you could share, like, and subscribe to all of our social media. We are on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on YouTube. So this webinar is even going to go to YouTube in a few days. So thank you all very much for the participation, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much to the organizers and to the participants.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.
Bye-bye.